Hello everyone, my name is Sophie Bush, and today I'll be presenting on my capstone, or Keystone, which is a holistic assessment of food insecurity in Native American communities. I wanted to begin my presentation with a quote. Colonial violence has never gone away. When you see statistics like alcoholism, diabetes, homicide, suicide rates on reservations, those are the physical manifestations of colonialism. My project focuses on food insecurity, which is another symptom of the colonial violence Native Americans have experienced. My project objective was to gain insight into the relationship between food insecurity rates and American Indian Alaskan Native, or AIAN, populations, and while anchoring my findings in the historical, social, and cultural factors which have contributed to and are the consequences of food insecurity in Native American communities. Now just to give a background on some of the terms I'll be using in my presentation, as well as some just general hunger research background. Food insecurity is when people don't have access to the food they need to live their fullest lives, and is one of the dependent variables I used in my data analysis, as well as child food insecurity, which is the percent of children who are food insecure. I also want to discuss the difference between food desert, which is the most commonly used term and one that you've probably heard before, and the term food apartheid, which is becoming preferred by hunger researchers. A food desert is essentially being moved away from because it equates food insecurity with geographic location and physical access to food, whereas food apartheid considers the many other factors such as food price when considering the food insecurity. Basically, Native Americans have experienced colonial violence since colonists arrived in 1492. Their food pathways were systematically targeted by colonists in order to eradicate their populations. The food pathways that were left intact were only further disrupted when Native American tribes were displaced onto reservations, losing their sovereignty and access to their land. In the 1880s and 1930s, Native American children were forced into Indian boarding schools with the goal of, quote-unquote, killing the Indian to save the man. And finally, from the 1960s to the present, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 reestablished tribal sovereignty to some degree, but obviously not to the levels that it was at before colonists arrived on their land. So to begin describing my data, I essentially Frankensteined a set of data sets together to create more comprehensive profiles of counties, and use linear regression with some of those variables as inputs in order to determine if there was a kind of relationship between food insecurity and having a majority AIAN population. The table shows some of the four kind of dimensions that I used as inputs into my regressions, with outputs with my output variables being food insecurity and child food insecurity. And the multiple combinations that I used, which were kind of a base combination, which was only one variable, intermediate, which was 3, and comprehensive, which was 4. The variables were majority AIAN population, which indicated if a county had a majority AIAN population. The percent of the population with only a high school diploma or less, which I kind of reinterpreted in my regressions as number of people per 100 with only a high school diploma or less for a better interpretability of the coefficients. The non-metropolitan county variable, which basically indicated if a county was non-metropolitan or not, kind of meant to represent ruralness, quote unquote, of a county. And finally, the poverty rate, which accounts for the poverty rate of the county. As you can see, I only used poverty rate in the comprehensive regression, as poverty rate has a very high correlation with food insecurity, and when I included it in my regressions, the coefficients of the other variables became extremely negligible and unreliable, and obviously I couldn't gain much insight from that, so I won't be discussing that one today, but you will see the results of my base and intermediate regressions. Before I get into the regressions, though, I looked into the historical data regarding food insecurity in AIAN households. As you can see here, the AIN households experience food insecurity as almost double the rate of white non-Hispanic households. And the tables below, which use data from non-metropolitan counties in order to account for some of the confounding factors which could be contributing to food insecurity below, show a roughly 7 percentage point difference in food insecurity between the two groups of counties for food insecurity, and for child food insecurity, you can see a almost 9 percentage point difference. Here is the results of my food insecurity linear regression. As I wanted to reiterate here that the regressions were not ran with the purpose of predicting, so you're going to see these R-squared values and say, those are really bad. And I want to quell your worries because it's basically I'm trying to see if there is a positive relationship between food insecurity and majority AI in population, and I'm not necessarily trying to quantify exactly the impact that it has at the moment. As you can see, both the base and intermediate regressions show a positive relationship between food insecurity and having a majority AIN population, with only a 1 percentage point drop as you add in other variables in the intermediate regression, which shows that basically there's some amount of explanation being done by whether or not a majority AIN population exists within a county. I also want to show that the intercept does drop pretty drastically between the base and intermediate regressions, and this is because the education variable, so the number of people per 100 with a high school diploma or less, takes on a lot of the explaining being done in terms of explaining the food insecurity rates of a county. You can see much of the same results with my child food insecurity rate regressions. We once again see a positive relationship between having a majority AIN population, and then the same explaining is done by education when you add it into the regression. Finally, I want to discuss the impacts that food insecurity can have on communities. And these impacts are experienced in different ways by different tribes. No two tribes have the same exact culture or history, and food insecurity is not necessarily experienced in the exact same ways across all these tribes. So the destruction of food pathways and persistent food apartheid have contributed to high food insecurity in Native American communities. High rates of child food insecurity have varied impacts on children, from increased hospitalizations as a toddler to developmental setbacks, as well as increased rates of suicidal ideation and depression in adolescents. Reliance on assistance programs, basically caused by the removal of these food pathways in Native American communities, have caused diets to become dominated by calorie-rich foods such as canned goods, which are high in fat and sugar, as opposed to nutrient-rich foods such as fresh produce, which are just better for a generally more healthful diet. Calorie-rich foods have been linked to an increased risk of diabetes, heart disease, and cancers, and the genetic impacts of these disorders are long-lasting, so even if food insecurity was to magically disappear tomorrow, these impacts would still be felt as they've accumulated throughout the generations. Food insecurity also contributes to poor mental health, as I briefly mentioned earlier. Native Americans are already at an increased risk for certain mental health disorders due to the generational trauma they've experienced through the genocide that their people experienced in the past. And food insecurity is associated with a 250% increased risk of anxiety and depression. That concludes my presentation, and I would like to acknowledge that the Boston University is located on the unceded lands of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples, whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. I wanted to say thank you to my advisors, Nitin Joglekar and Patricia Cortez, Shannon Maynard of the Congressional Hunger Center, Sam Cook, my Kilachand professor for my class this semester, my family, especially my dad, who connected me with Maynard, and for supporting me through, and my family in general for supporting me through this process. And thank you again to Feeding America for allowing me to use their Map the Meal Gap data, which made up the bulk of my data through this project. And lastly, thank you for listening. Any questions?
So, this may be outside of the scope of your project, but do you know about if Native American food culture has been influenced at all by their lack of access to resources? I think the only example that comes to mind to me is fry bread, which is a very famous traditional food, I think, in some tribes. So I don't know if you have anything you know about that.
Yeah. Certainly some of the literature review that I did touch on these facts. Fry bread actually does come from flour and everything, and I believe from what I remember that it became introduced more after when their diets became more westernized. And sorry, I'm trying to. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on what the rest of your question was.
I was asking in general if you noticed that Native food culture was influenced at all by their lack of access to it.
Definitely. Certainly the lack of access to the traditional food pathways restricted access to their traditional diets. And additionally, the destruction of these pathways, for example, bison were specifically targeted. Obviously, by not having access to bison, that made up a major part of their economy and their diets, and that definitely impacted their traditional to post-colonial. And just generally the diets have become more westernized, like I said, because of reliance on food assistance programs and yeah.
Great job. Thank you for your presentation. Looking back on your project, and then if you were to continue this project, are there any other additional variables that you feel like you would want to study or you saw in your data set and was like, oh, that would have been interesting to include as well?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I had any. I certainly, there's, shoot, I'm trying to think if I had any other ideas. I need to ponder that one for a second. I think that the main ones I was looking at were like education, trying to find a proxy for education, and then a proxy for but there's obviously poverty rate, and then as well as I'm totally blanking what the other one was. Oh my gosh. Ugh. Oh well, sorry, I'm totally blanking. But there aren't necessarily any other variables that are coming to mind immediately that I wish I could have been able to quantify. But yeah, I can get back to you on that one because I might just be like totally blanking.
Awesome job. I was just wondering if there were any like big or small challenges that you kind of faced during your research process, because this is obviously like a really big topic and it was really cool to see everything, but yeah.
Yeah. Basically, the data I used is from 2021, which obviously we're still coming right out of COVID from there, and I wish I had access to data that was more recent and is a little bit more accounted for, or I don't know, more representative of I don't know, the quote unquote normal, I suppose. So that was a little bit of a struggle because I was trying to make sure that I didn't have anything that was too thrown by basically the impacts of COVID. However, also another challenge I had was compiling all the data and kind of, like I said, Frankensteining it all together. Grabbing data from so many different sources took a long time to just clean and then also, compile. And that was probably what the bulk of my project was on. But also, this project also started this semester. So I began essentially in mid-February, I want to say. And so it was very a speed run of the project for sure. But yeah, so those are probably the biggest things I encountered.
Great job.
Thank you.
I was curious if there's anything that surprised you throughout the process.
Yeah. There's a lot of surprising, sad things, I suppose. Kind of the disparity was much larger than I was expecting. And also doing the historical research into Native American communities and the colonial violence they faced, learning exactly how many millions and millions of indigenous peoples were murdered throughout the Americas through colonialism was quite, I don't know, that was quite jarring. Because I always knew obviously a lot, but I never put a number. So yeah, that was really difficult to process. But yeah, those are the biggest surprises. But I also learned that there's a lot more focus on specifically food insecurity in Native communities than I thought going into the project. So I was really happy to see that it was being addressed and through a variety of ways, including by promoted food sovereignty, which essentially empowers Native communities to take control of their food pathways and food and their diets and everything. And so that was a brighter spot, I suppose, than what I mentioned before.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay.